Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing well this week. Just to kind of recap where we're at and how we're going to finish out the next few weeks. We first went over fibers, all the different types and sources, and then we talked about how those fibers are transferred into yarns, and then last week we began talking about how those yarns are made into fabrics. And again, the two major ways in which that is done is either weaving or knitting. So we spent all last week talking about weaving, and this week we are going to talk about knitting. So again, this week we're going to be focusing on knitting, which is a fabrication process where needles are used to form a series of interlocking loops from one or more yarns or a set of yarns. And in comparison to weaving, where we had the warp and the weft, the wales in knitting are the vertical columns of stitches, and the courses are the horizontal rows. So you can kind of think of it in the same way that we think about knitting in terms of those the vertical and the horizontal lines. When there is a dominance of horizontal lines, that is referred to as filling or weft knitting, which obviously translates to the filling and weft that we were talking about last week with respect to weaving. And then when there is a dominance of vertical lines, that is called warp knitting. Some of you may knit as a hobby or have a family member that does knitting. And of course that's done by hand. In full-scale or more commercial fabric production, knitting is going to be done via machines. So this is a picture of a machine that would do the knitting. And this kind of shows you how the yarns are fed into the machine, and it's based on a pattern that is entered into the computer. And the knitting occurs inside the enclosed section there. And there are some safety reasons why the machine can't be operated if the cover is up. So that all kind of plays into workplace safety. But basically, yes, so the knitting that is done by hand, it's a very similar process, but done on a more mass scale. A machine that looks like this would actually be used. Now we're going to take a look at the general differences between knitting and weaving as we move further into the topic of knitting in comparison to what we talked about last week. And the best way to think about these differences is to sort of visualize a sweater versus a woven shirt of some kind, just something pretty general. But in terms of comfort and appearance retention, let's say a bulky sweater is going to be, they are pretty elastic if you've ever played around with them. Some of my most comfortable sweaters are, I love them because of their elasticity. I just find that to be something that makes them more comfortable. But in comparison to a woven shirt, just their elasticity is quite a bit less, so they are more stable to stress. And of course the recovery varies. I'm just thinking of a general shirt here. But in comparison to knit fabrics, knits tend to have a bit more elasticity, but as a result of that and the way they are made, they are a bit bulkier too. In terms of cover, again, it's going to vary within knits as far as how much space is in between the loops that are created there. But of course there's sometimes some of them can even be almost see-through depending on how big that space is. But generally speaking, they are less opaque because of the porous nature of knits. Weaves tend to have a bit more hiding power. In terms of fabric stability, knits tend to be a bit less stable and have higher shrinkage. So some of you may have shrunken a sweater before. It goes in one size and it comes out a size that's completely smaller, or one whole size less. They are less stable than weaves that do have a bit of a lower shrinkage rate. Again, generally speaking. Of course, there's variability within both of these categories, but this is just to kind of generally compare the two processes. From an economic perspective, the main point here is that the machines that are used to knit fabrics can be changed a bit quicker to keep in line with whatever the current trends are. It costs a bit more to change the machines that use weaving as a manufacturing process. Now, of course, with knits you're using a bit more yarn, so it is all relative, but again, the main takeaway here is that knitting, the machines used for knitting are just a bit more adaptable, and as a result, it's less costly. In terms of fabric structure and characteristics, because of those interconnected loops in knits and the fact that more yarn is used, they often tend to be a bit heavier. So you need more drawer space for a bunch of sweaters that you're going to fold versus a bunch of woven shirts. So, of course, with weaving, because of the interlacing of the yarns, they are often a bit lighter. So those are the main differences between, general differences between knit fabrics and woven fabrics. As I mentioned a few slides ago, there are two types of knitting, warp knitting and weft knitting, which correlates with the warp and weft weaving. But first we're going to talk about filling or weft knitting. And that is where one yarn is carried back and forth in a horizontal fashion. So again, this can be either done by hand or by a machine. But some filling knit fabrics are jersey. Anything jersey is a knit. So jersey t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all that kind of stuff, that all falls into this category. And the main difference between, so you can look under your kit in 120 and 121, those are some examples of jersey fabrics. Jacquard jersey, if you remember we talked about jacquard last week, is when there's a pattern, there's variations in the yarn in terms of color and type to create the pattern, and that results in a front and back that look really different. So 127 and 128, and actually 126 as well, are examples of jacquard jersey, so you can see the patterns that are incorporated there. This is a really close-up view of a jersey knit fabric. So you can see the interlocking loops here. You can also see, to a certain extent, the holes that run in between the fabric. And then here on the right, on the back side, you can tell, you can see that the horizontal lines here are more dominant with this type of knit. A third type of filling or weft knitting fabric are pile jerseys. Those are considered fancier fabrics. They look like a woven pile, but they're a bit more pliable and stretchy. So examples of pile jerseys are knit terry cloth, which you can see under 141, velour, and fake fur. Another type of filling or weft knitting are fabrics that are considered or called weft insertion jerseys, which pretty much directly correlates with what's happening here. So an additional yarn is inserted in the loops. It's not actually knit in there. So what this ends up doing to the fabric is giving it more strength, comfort, or even visual interest depending on how it's done. So examples of this are French terry, which is number 143, and fleece, number 144. So go take a look at those. But again, this is just one of the additional types of filling or weft knitting. Finally, we have double filling knits as the final type of filling or weft knitting. And these are created with a machine that uses two beds of needles. So there's different types of double filling knits, and it's categorized based on the arrangement of needles and the gait of the machine. So just to get a little more in-depth here, but not too crazy, rib gating is when the two beds are positioned such that both needles can knit at the same time. Interlock gating is when the needles are positioned such that only one needle bed can knit at a time. And then purl gating is when both of the needle beds are on the same plane, and then the needle can travel between the two beds. So just to give you some fabric examples here, rib gating, examples of that is 130, 132, and 135. And you can kind of see why it might be called rib gating. It almost kind of has like a rib in there. Interlock gating is 133 and 134. So those just kind of that gives you an idea of the fabrics that result from these different types of double filling knits. Again, we're not going to get much more in depth beyond just this general description of how it's done here, but just so you can get an idea of this type of manufacturing and the fabrics that result from that. This picture provides a really good example of the different knits side by side with one another, so you can see what we're talking about here, and it also demonstrates how within one garment or one product of very different types of manufacturing processes can be used. So on the top you can see that's a knit done via, it's a jersey knit, and then you have a purl knit just beneath that, and then on the bottom you have two different types of rib knits. So again, you can see that kind of ribbing structure that is created by that double filling method, but again, so several different types within one garment is obviously going to translate to a higher cost, just because it's not you're not just doing a basic one type of manufacturing there. But seeing them close in this close-up picture, juxtaposed like that, you can tell the differences between all the different types and how it can create different looks for either different garments or within one. Now we're going to talk about warp knitting. And again, as a reminder, weft knitting is when the yarns move in a horizontal fashion. With warp knitting, the yarns move vertically in more of a zigzag fashion. So this picture demonstrates it way better than I could ever articulate it, but you can see on the left there's a bit more almost standardization in a way, or uniformity is actually probably a better word. It's a bit more uniform with the filling knitting on the left. And then when you look on the right, you can see how the kind of a zigzag results from the yarns moving vertically. And it's a bit less standardized, more haphazard in a way. But anyway, those pictures give you an idea of the difference between filling knitting and warp knitting.
Within the category of warp knitting, there are two basic types, the first being tricot, the second being Rochelle. Tricot is an interesting story because this was actually a machine that was developed in 1775 in England, and the machine was called a tricot machine. It's sometimes called a warp loom because it uses one or more sets of yarns wound on warp beams and mounted on the knitting machine. So tricot's been around for quite some time, and it now is a generic name for all warp knit fabrics, which tend to be stable, more stable than filling knits with very little elasticity. So the types of fabrics that you'll see using the tricot knit would be things like lingerie, sleepwear, even automotive type upholstery. So if you take a look in your fabric kit, you will see examples of tricot from 146 through 148. It can also be brushed so you have a raised surface. That would be fabric 149. And you can also take a look at a tricot warp pile of fabric swatches 150 and 151. On the flip side, you have the Rochelle knits, and that machine has 1 to 2 needle beds with latch needles that are set in a vertical position. So here the types of knits you'll see are made with heavier yarns. They have much more elaborate design, but they also incorporate more open areas into the design. So think about netting, and you'll see Rochelle knits used for a variety of different kinds of fancy fabrics, everything from heavier weight, even carpets, to lightweight household items like thermal cloths. And you can see examples of Rochelle knits in your textile kit swatches 152 to 160.
Here are some close-up photographs of Rochelle knit fabrics. So you can get an idea of some of the uses for them as well. So the top left photograph is actually an onion bag. If you've ever bought onions in bulk from the grocery store, they almost always come in these types of bags. And those are actually made from tape yarns that have been knit together. The picture on the right is a Rochelle knit laundry bag. So you can see up close how the yarns are put together for that type of an item. The bottom left is, of course, lace that is formed by yarn that is actually laid between the stitches. And then the bottom right is a knit fabric that is used in women's undergarments. Now we're moving into Chapter 15, which covers all other fabrication methods. So basically, any textiles that are not manufactured via weaving or knitting are going to fall into this category, which of course, like all the others, has subcategories. So the first one being fabrics that are manufactured from solutions. And this includes films and foams. So films are made directly from a polymer solution by melt extrusion or by casting the solution onto a hot drum. The solutions are quite similar to the fiber spinning solutions and are usually vinyl or polyurethane. Films are used for apparel, interior, and technical products as well. So there's a wide variety of uses, but you can see a sample of this as number 161, and that's a shower curtain. So that's technically a film that's used for that particular product. Foams are made by incorporating air into an elastic-like substance, the most common being polyurethane. And these are used for carpet backing, underlays, paddings, and that type of, or those types of, for those types of products. You can see an example of that, 162. That's a vinyl film face, and then the foam is actually on the back. So, again, a bit more industrial in terms of use, but nevertheless, these are fabrics that are made from solutions.
So we kind of finished talking about knitting method here. Then, is there any other fabrication method other than either weaving or knitting method? Here are some examples. First, films. Films are made directly from a polymer solution by melt extrusion or by casting the solution into a hot drum. Films are mostly used for industry uses rather than our clothes, and one of the most common example of film fabric is vinyl. You know, like any kind of zipper bag in your kitchen or some industry furnishings. And the other type is foams. Foams are made by incorporating air into an elastic-like substance. So you can think about some kind of sponge or mattress.
So another fabrication method that does not fall under knitting or weaving includes fabrics that are made directly from fibers. So for these fabrics, the yarn production stage has basically been skipped, and the fabrics are made directly from the fibers. So, and the fibers are put together for pretty much each of these by creating sort of a web, by linking the fibers together directly. So the first example of that is a tapa cloth. You don't have an example of that in your kit, but there's a picture of it here. But that's when the fiber from the bark of trees is put together via a web to create that particular fabric. Fiber web is made by arranged bonded fibers into a web as well. Pretty quick and cheap production. You've got some examples of that as numbers 164 through 167 in your kit, so you can feel the different types of fabrics that fall under that category. Fiber fill is not exactly a fabric, but it's an important component for apparel, and that's the filling that primarily goes in pillows and things like that. So that's just sort of bulk fibers, but it's not necessarily considered a fabric. And then there's felt, which is mostly wool, but it's when the fibers are held together by the interlocking scales instead of the wool being manufactured into some yarn first. So for that reason, felt is pretty weak, and that's why you're able to rip it apart so easily, and it's primarily used in crafts and things of that nature. But you can see a wallet here, so sometimes you'll see felt for other uses. But anyway, again, these are fabrics that are made directly from fibers. Other fabrication methods include fabrics from yarns and composite fabrics. So fabrics from yarns are basically those that have been created from interlacing yarns together. So that includes braids, lace, and embroidery. And the interesting thing about embroidery is that the yarn can be arranged in any direction. Prior to this point, almost all of the methods we've talked about, the yarn either has to be horizontal or vertical or what have you. And with embroidery, there's a bit more leeway, so the yarn can be arranged any way. So it can be done by hand or by machine, but embroidery a lot of times is associated with it being hand done, so that being sort of the special quality of it. But anyway, as far as composite fabrics go, there are a bunch of different kinds. Composite fabrics are when there are several different structures included into a fabric, but at least one of them is a recognized textile structure. As far as the ones you really need to know, I've listed them here. So there's coated fabrics, and those are created when a textile has been combined with a polymer film. Examples of this are PVC and neoprene. So PVC is used a lot in window shades, shoe liners, book covers, upholstery, so a lot of industrial, more commercial uses. And neoprene is used in primarily in protective apparel, like gloves. You're seeing a lot more of these types of fabrics on runways just for the cool factor, just giving, something different. And of course there's some function to it as well. Also with respect to poromoric or microporous fabrics, which incorporate very thin and microporous films. So an example of that is Gore-Tex, and you have a sample of that in your kit, number 168. That fabric is waterproof, windproof, and breathable. So we're talking about fabrics here that are really high on the from a functional perspective, but again, you're seeing a lot more of it on the runway. And the coated and the poromoric fabrics, or poromeric, I'm sorry, are considered sort of the next generation. They're associated a lot with smartwear and sort of the up-and-coming types of fabrics. So you will see a lot more of this being used into the future. But again, there's not a whole lot of examples of these in your textile kit, so it might be a good idea to do some research so that you can see more examples of that. But at any rate, there is a school of thought that this is going to be sort of the next generation of fabrics. Other composite fabrics include suede-like fabrics, so pleather, you have an example of that as number 170. Stitch bonded, which includes quilted fabrics, that sample is 171, and then tufted fabrics, which include chenille, and you get an example of that in 174. So again, there are several other fabrication methods, but these are the primary ones that you need to know for the exam. In the last slide, I mentioned the commercial uses for a lot of these next generation fabrics. So here's just some examples of how those have been used. You can see the PVC in a more industrial sense on the top left, but then on the very right you can see it used for high fashion. So again, you're seeing a lot more of these types of fabrics being used in a trendy fashion setting. And then in the middle, you can see the windbreaker and then the shoe on the bottom, manufactured out of the Gore-Tex fabric, which again, the main idea there is that it has a lot of function to it. So in addition to protecting you from water, it's also breathable. If you've ever worn just a regular rain jacket, yes, that's great to keep the water off you, but a lot of times it's uncomfortable once you get inside, or once it's not raining, there's no use for it because it really is just sort of giving you a complete barrier to the water or the rain. But the Gore-Tex is sort of special because it doesn't necessarily feel quite like you're encapsulating yourself in a garbage bag quite so much. So again, it'll be interesting to see how these fabrics are used more with respect to apparel moving forward. But again, these are just some examples of how the industrial aspects of these fabrics are sort of crossing over into apparel use. Finally, for other fabrication methods, we have animal products. And this is where we're talking about real or natural leather, suede, and fur. So first off, we're going to look at leather and suede, which comes from the same source. And so the difference actually is that suede is made by napping or sanding the leather, which is basically what's happening there. So originally it's the same, it's coming from the same place. And those places are cattle, goats, sheep, sometimes fish, birds, and other reptiles. So snake skin, alligator skin, all those types of products are generally considered to be leather, or leathers that are coming from those animals. And the leathers are a byproduct of the animals that are raised for meat. So for example, with a cow, the meat goes for food, and then the skins are used for the leather to be used as a fabric. In terms of what needs to be done in between taking the the pelts from the animals and getting those to a point where they can be used as fabric in other products, the pelts have to be cleaned and the hair has to be removed from them. And then the leather has to be tanned, and that's the process that makes leather pliable and water resistant. The process does result in some hazardous waste, so for that reason it's highly regulated in the US, and there's not that many companies that do leather tanning. But there's a link to a video here if you'd like to watch the process of leather production. There's also a link to it on Canvas. Last but not least, we have fur, which of course is also an animal product, but the sources of fur are a bit different than those of leather. So you can see here fur primarily comes from mink, rabbits, foxes, muskrats, and chinchillas. So the process for getting fur ready to be used as a fabric in a product is called tanning. So it's kind of the fur version of tanning. Like with leather, there's also some issues with fur. There's animal rights issues. I have actually just some pictures of one of the, I think it was a Sex and the City episode, not the movie. I can't remember honestly, but where one of the characters is wearing a fur jacket in New York and gets paint all over it by some protesters. So it's sort of a controversial issue, but nevertheless, it is a recognized fabric. And again, these are the sources from which the fur comes. A couple of slides ago, I mentioned sort of the next generation fabrics in terms of PVC and neoprene and Gore-Tex and that sort of thing. But there are some other fabric innovations in terms of animal products, and you can almost call them more natural fabrics. So this is a really cool TED Talk from a clothing designer who has basically created her own animal produced fabric. So at any rate, it's a little bit long, but it's really interesting, and I thought you might enjoy watching the video. So again, the link is here, and then it's also on Canvas.
This week we covered knitting, and here the recap includes filling and weft knitting as well as warp knitting. So in the fill and weft knitting, more jersey fabrics and double fill fabrics, and on the warp knitting side, more of the tricots and the Rochelles. We also covered other types of production methods, fabrics that are made from solutions, fibers, yarns, and composite fabrics, as well as animals, including leather, suede, and fur. So that takes us through the week, and you do have a weekly assignment on the next slide. For this week's assignment, you're going to be doing a little bit of detective work, and this is concerning the differences between wovens and knits. So what you're going to do is use two different fabrics from your textile kit, fabric number 21 and fabric number 86, and you're going to unravel a couple of yarns from each one of those fabrics, and you're going to determine which one is a knit and which one is a woven. Then you're going to find garments that you own, one woven and one knit, and you're going to compare those two fabrics based on their structure. Then you're going to, based on these findings, you're going to write a half a page paper, 1-inch margins all around, to explain the differences that you see in those wovens and knits, both in terms of appearance and serviceability. And the reason why you're doing this is it's so important when you get into the fashion business to understand the differences between wovens and knits, and to learn to discern how to see the difference between them. So that's why you're doing this detective work, and as with all the other weekly assignments, this one is due on Friday at 5 p.m. Have a great week.